Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we are confronting a new realm of fear with 8 of the most disturbing true home alone horror stories ever documented. These accounts are not urban legends or recycled narratives. They are painstakingly compiled from genuine reports and first-hand submissions, retold with utmost respect for the harrowing experiences behind them. Each tale unfurls a unique nightmare, from uninvited stalkers to silent intruders hidden in the walls, reminding us that the terror of isolation sometimes arises from real and lurking threats. While some names and identifying details have been modified to safeguard those who survived these ordeals, the authenticity and gravity of what transpired remains completely intact. If you value real horror from the dark corners of true life, you are in the right place. Be sure to subscribe to Buried Files for more in-depth accounts that will haunt your nights, and activate notifications so you never miss when the unknown comes knocking. My name is Marcus Johnson, and what I am about to share happened during my junior year at Arizona State University. I had been living in a rental house near campus with 2 roommates, but when winter break arrived in December, they both went home to their families while I stayed behind to work at a local restaurant. The extra shifts meant good money, and honestly, I welcomed the quiet after months of constant noise and chaos. The house was a typical college rental, a 2-story place built in the 1970s with a finished basement that we used as a hangout space. It had wood paneling, old carpet, and a separate entrance that led directly outside through metal storm doors. We rarely locked those basement doors since we figured nobody would want to steal our beat-up furniture and gaming consoles. For the first few days alone, everything felt normal. I would wake up, grab breakfast, head to work, and return home to an empty house. The silence was actually refreshing. But by the end of the first week, I started noticing small things that did not quite make sense. My milk carton, which had been nearly full when I left for my shift, was almost empty when I returned home. I blamed it on my poor memory. Maybe I had been drinking more than I realized. Then my leftover pizza disappeared from the refrigerator. Again, I convinced myself that I must have eaten it late one night and forgotten. The missing food bothered me, but I tried to rationalize it away. College life had trained me to assume that everything had a logical explanation, even when it did not feel right. I started writing down what food I had before leaving for work just to keep track. Sure enough, items kept vanishing. A half loaf of bread gone, an entire container of deli turkey missing, crackers disappearing from the pantry. The pattern was consistent. Someone was taking just enough to eat, but not so much that it would be immediately obvious. Whoever was doing this knew how to avoid detection. I began to suspect that one of my roommates had returned early and was playing some kind of elaborate prank. I searched their rooms looking for signs that they had come back without telling me, but everything remained exactly as they had left it. Their beds were still unmade, their belongings undisturbed. That was when I started paying attention to other details around the house. The basement television had been left on one morning when I was certain I had turned it off the night before. The couch cushions were arranged differently than how I remembered them. Small changes that could easily be dismissed as forgetfulness, but the accumulation was becoming impossible to ignore. I decided to test my theory. Before leaving for work one Thursday morning, I carefully arranged items in the basement in specific ways. A magazine placed at an exact angle on the coffee table, couch pillows positioned precisely, the television remote set in an unusual spot. When I returned that evening, everything had been moved. The magazine was on the floor, the pillows were bunched up as if someone had been sleeping on them. The remote was on the opposite side of the room. Someone had definitely been in my house while I was gone, and they were making themselves comfortable in the basement. My first instinct was to call the police, but I hesitated. What would I tell them? That my food was disappearing and my furniture was moving? They would think I was paranoid or making things up. I needed more concrete proof before involving authorities. Instead, I decided to set up my own surveillance system. I positioned my laptop in the basement with its camera facing the main living area and set it to record while I was at work. The battery would not last all day, but it might capture something useful. The next evening, I rushed home and immediately checked the recording. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. The basement remained empty and still. But then, at the 3-hour mark, I watched in absolute horror as the basement door opened and a man emerged from behind the water heater. He was middle-aged, wearing dirty clothes that looked like they had not been changed in weeks. His hair was greasy and unkempt, and he moved through the basement with the confidence of someone who knew the layout intimately. He walked to the couch, sat down, and turned on the television as if he owned the place. I watched in stunned silence as this stranger ate my food, used my bathroom, and made himself completely at home. He had clearly been living in my basement for an unknown amount of time, hiding behind the water heater during the day and emerging when I was gone. The water heater area was in a dark corner that we never accessed, hidden behind some old boxes and holiday decorations. The recording showed him staying active for several hours before disappearing back behind the water heater. He knew my schedule. He knew exactly when I left for work and when I would return. This had been going on for who knows how long, and I had been completely oblivious. My hands shook as I called 911. The dispatcher seemed skeptical at first, but when I explained that I had video evidence of someone living in my basement without permission, she took me seriously. Police arrived within 20 minutes and I showed them the recording. 4 officers searched the house while I waited outside. They found his makeshift living space behind the water heater, a sleeping bag, bottles of water, and containers for human waste. He had created a small but functional living area in the darkest corner of the basement, complete with stolen food items and personal belongings that I had assumed were lost or misplaced over the months. The man was not there when they searched, but they found evidence that he had been coming and going through the basement storm doors, which had a broken lock that we had never bothered to fix. He had probably been watching the house for weeks before moving in, learning our routines and finding the perfect hiding spot. Officers told me that this was more common than people realized. Empty or partially occupied homes near college campuses were frequent targets for transients looking for temporary shelter. They often chose basements, attics, or other rarely used spaces where they could hide during the day and move around when residents were gone. The police set up surveillance and caught him 2 days later when he returned to collect his belongings. He had been living in my basement for over 6 weeks, surviving on stolen food and using our utilities. During questioning, he admitted that he had been in the house even when my roommates were there. But it was much easier to move around freely when I was alone. What disturbed me most was learning that he had been watching me sleep. He knew my schedule so well because he had been observing me for weeks, noting when I went to bed, when I woke up, and when I left for work. He had complete access to the house and had been moving through it silently while I was unconscious upstairs. The man was arrested for breaking and entering, burglary, and criminal trespass. He had a history of similar incidents and had been homeless for several years. The police explained that he probably chose our house because it looked like a typical college rental. Easy access, minimal security, and residents who were often away. I could not sleep in that house for weeks afterward. Every sound made me wonder if someone else was hiding somewhere, waiting for me to leave or fall asleep. We installed new locks, security cameras, and motion sensors throughout the house. I checked behind that water heater obsessively even though I knew it was empty. My roommates returned from break to find the house transformed into a fortress. When I explained what had happened, they were horrified but also fascinated. They wanted to see the video and hear every detail about how someone had been living with us without our knowledge. The story spread quickly through our friend group and became legendary on campus, but for me it was not an interesting story to share at parties. It was a fundamental violation of safety and security that changed how I viewed private spaces forever. The idea that someone can secretly share your home, watch your routines, and live off your resources without detection is terrifying in a way that few people truly understand unless they have experienced it. Even now, years later, I still check behind water heaters and in dark corners whenever I move to a new place. I secure every possible entry point and remain hyper-vigilant about unexplained changes in my environment. That experience taught me that home invasion does not always involve broken windows or kicked-in doors. Sometimes the most dangerous intruders are the ones you never know are there. The basement tenant had been my unwelcome roommate for over a month, and if I had not started paying attention to the small details, he might have continued living there indefinitely. That realization still gives me chills, knowing that someone was sharing my space, breathing the same air, and watching my life unfold from the shadows. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and I am a single mother living in Tampa, Florida. What happened to me 3 months ago still makes me question everything I thought I knew about safety and technology. It was a Tuesday night in June when Hurricane Debbie was approaching the coast, bringing with it the kind of electrical storms that turn the sky into a war zone. My daughter Sophia was only 8 months old at the time, and like most new mothers, I had become obsessed with monitoring her sleep. I had installed one of those high-tech baby monitors with video and audio capabilities, the kind that connects to your phone and promises to give you peace of mind. The base unit sat on Sophia's dresser, and I kept the handheld receiver with me wherever I went in the house. That particular evening, the storm had knocked out power to half the neighborhood, but our house still had electricity. The wind was howling outside and rain pelted against the windows with such force that I worried the glass might crack. Sophia had been fussy all day because of the atmospheric pressure, but she had finally fallen asleep around 8 o'clock. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when the baby monitor started acting strangely. Instead of the usual soft static or gentle breathing sounds from Sophia's room, I began hearing what sounded like fragments of conversation. At first, I assumed it was interference from other electronic devices in the neighborhood, something that occasionally happened during storms. The voices were faint and distorted, cutting in and out with the static. I could not make out specific words, but there seemed to be at least 2 people talking back and forth. I walked closer to Sophia's room to check if the sounds were actually coming from there, but when I peeked inside, she was sleeping peacefully. The voices were definitely coming through the monitor, not from the room itself. I tried adjusting the frequency settings, thinking maybe the device was picking up radio transmissions or signals from another baby monitor in the area. But as I fiddled with the controls, the voices became clearer, and what I heard made my blood run cold. A man's voice said, "She put the baby down about 20 minutes ago." Then a second voice, also male, replied, "Good. Give it another hour before we make our move." I stood frozen in my kitchen, gripping the monitor so tightly that my knuckles turned white. These were not random radio signals or crossed wires from another family's baby monitor. These people were talking about me and Sophia, and they seemed to know our schedule with frightening accuracy. The conversation continued sporadically over the next few minutes, always with the same 2 voices discussing details about our house and routine. They mentioned that I usually went to bed around 10:30 and that I always checked on Sophia one last time before turning off the lights. They knew which rooms had windows facing the street and which ones were hidden from view. My first instinct was to call 911, but I hesitated because I knew how crazy it would sound. What would I tell them? That my baby monitor was picking up voices of people planning to break into my house? They would probably assume I was having some kind of postpartum anxiety episode or that the storm was making me paranoid. Instead, I decided to investigate further. I grabbed my phone and started recording the audio from the baby monitor, hoping to capture evidence of what I was hearing. The voices came and went with the static, but I managed to record several minutes of clear conversation. "The back door looks like the easiest entry point," one voice said. "No deadbolt, just a regular handle lock." "What about the dog?" the second voice asked. "There is no dog. I've been watching for 3 days. Just her and the baby." My legs nearly gave out when I heard that. Someone had been watching my house for 3 days, studying our routines and planning some kind of break-in. The detail about the back door was particularly terrifying because it was accurate. I had been meaning to install a deadbolt but had not gotten around to it yet. I crept through the house, turning off all the lights and checking every window and door to make sure they were locked. My hands shook as I drew all the curtains and blinds, suddenly aware of how exposed I had been living. If someone had been watching us for 3 days, they had seen everything. When I fed Sophia, when I did laundry, when I took showers. The storm outside was getting worse, with thunder that seemed to shake the entire house. Each flash of lightning illuminated the yard for a split second, and I found myself scanning for signs of movement or unusual shadows. But the real terror was coming through that baby monitor, which continued to broadcast fragments of conversation throughout the evening. Around 9:30, I heard one of the voices say, "Lights are going out in the front rooms. She is getting ready for bed." I had indeed been turning off lights as I made my final rounds through the house, following my usual bedtime routine without realizing I was being observed. The fact that they could see into my house and coordinate their observations through some kind of radio communication was beyond frightening. I called my sister Maria, who lived about 15 minutes away, and asked her to come over. I could not explain everything over the phone without sounding completely insane, but I told her I was scared and needed someone to stay the night. She could hear the panic in my voice and agreed to drive over despite the storm. While waiting for Maria to arrive, I continued monitoring the radio transmissions. The voices discussed timing, entry methods, and what they were looking for once they got inside. They mentioned jewelry, electronics, and cash, making it clear that this was a planned burglary. But they also talked about making sure we did not wake up during the process, which implied they knew we would be home. "If she wakes up, we just tie her up until we are finished," one voice said casually. "The baby will not be a problem." That was the moment I realized these people were not just planning to rob my house. They were prepared to use violence if necessary. The casual way they discussed restraining me and dismissing Sophia as not a problem suggested they had done this before and knew how to handle complications. Maria arrived around 10:15, soaked from the rain and confused about why I had sounded so panicked on the phone. I showed her the baby monitor and played back some of the recordings I had captured on my phone. At first, she was skeptical, suggesting it might be interference from emergency services or utility workers dealing with storm damage. But as we listened together, more transmissions came through with specific details about our house and movements. The voices discussed which car was mine in the driveway, mentioned that a light was still on in the kitchen, and noted that a second person had arrived. "There is another car now," one voice observed. "Looks like she has company." "Should we wait?" the second voice asked. "No, stick to the plan. 2 women and a baby, we can handle it." Maria's face went white when she heard that. She immediately called 911 while I continued recording the transmissions. The police dispatcher took the call seriously, especially when Maria explained that we had audio recordings of people planning to break into the house that night. 2 patrol cars arrived within 10 minutes, and I played the recordings for the officers. They were initially puzzled by the baby monitor situation, but became very concerned when they heard the specific details about our house and the casual discussion of violence. The officers conducted a thorough search of the property and surrounding area. Behind the trees at the back of my yard, they found 2 men in a pickup truck with radio equipment and binoculars. The men had been using short-range radios to communicate while conducting surveillance, and somehow their frequency had been picked up by my baby monitor's receiver. Both men were arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit burglary, stalking, and possession of burglary tools. Their truck contained rope, duct tape, crowbars, and detailed notes about my daily routine. They had been watching the house for over a week, not 3 days, as they had mentioned on the radio. During questioning, police learned that this was part of a larger operation targeting single mothers in the area. The men would identify houses with young children, conduct surveillance to learn routines, and then break in when they believed the occupants would be asleep. They specifically chose homes where they thought resistance would be minimal. The baby monitor had saved our lives by accidentally intercepting their radio communications. If I had not heard those transmissions, they would have broken in around midnight and found us completely unprepared. The police said it was extremely unusual for baby monitors to pick up two-way radio signals, but the storm conditions and their proximity to the house had created perfect circumstances for the interference. After that night, I could not sleep peacefully for months. Every sound from the baby monitor made me jump, wondering if I was hearing normal household noises or something more sinister. I installed a complete security system with cameras, motion sensors, and professional monitoring. I moved Sophia's crib into my bedroom and kept it there for weeks. The most disturbing part was realizing how vulnerable we had been without knowing it. These men had been watching us, learning our habits, and planning violence while I went about my normal routine completely unaware. The baby monitor that was supposed to help me protect Sophia had accidentally revealed how much danger we were really in. I still use baby monitors, but I have learned to pay attention to unusual sounds or interference. Technology can be both a shield and a window, protecting us from some dangers while accidentally revealing others. That storm brought more than just wind and rain. It brought the terrifying knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The case went to trial 6 months later, and both men received significant prison sentences. But knowing they are locked up does not erase the memory of hearing strangers discuss breaking into my home and threatening my child. Some violations of safety and privacy leave permanent scars, changing how you view the world and your place in it forever. My name is Tyler Washington, and I work as a night security guard for a large office complex in Detroit, Michigan. Due to the pandemic, my company had transitioned to remote monitoring, which meant I could do most of my job from home using multiple computer screens and camera feeds. It was actually perfect for me. I could work nights while taking care of my elderly grandmother during the day, and the pay was decent enough to support both of us. Our house is a small 2-story place in a quiet neighborhood where most residents are elderly or working families. I had converted the basement into my home office, setting up multiple monitors to watch security feeds from various buildings downtown. The setup was impressive. 6 large screens showing different angles of lobbies, parking garages, and office floors that I monitored from midnight until 8 in the morning. My routine was consistent and methodical. I would start my shift at midnight, make coffee, and settle into my chair for 8 hours of surveillance. Every hour I would do a virtual patrol, checking each camera feed systematically and documenting anything unusual. Around 3 in the morning, I would take a 15-minute break to stretch my legs and grab a snack from the kitchen. At 6, I would make another cup of coffee to get through the final stretch. This routine had been working perfectly for almost a year when something started to feel wrong. It began 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday night when I heard footsteps upstairs during my shift. At first, I assumed it was my grandmother getting up to use the bathroom, which happened occasionally despite her usually sleeping soundly through the night. But when I checked on her a few minutes later, she was fast asleep in her bed. The next night, I heard the same pattern of footsteps around the same time. Slow, deliberate walking from the kitchen to the living room, then back to the kitchen. Again, I found my grandmother sleeping peacefully when I investigated. I started to wonder if the house was settling or if I was hearing sounds from neighboring houses, but the footsteps were distinctly coming from directly above my basement office. By the end of that first week, the footsteps had become a nightly occurrence. They always happened around 2:30 in the morning, always followed the same path through the kitchen and living room, and always lasted about 5 minutes. But my grandmother was always asleep when I checked, and she never mentioned being up during the night. What made it truly disturbing was how closely the footsteps matched my own routine. I realized that the timing coincided exactly with when I would normally take my break and walk through the kitchen to get a snack. Someone upstairs was mimicking my movements, following the same path I took every night, but they were doing it while I was still in the basement. I started paying closer attention to other sounds in the house. The coffee maker would turn on at 3:15 every morning, which was when I typically made my second pot of coffee. But I had not turned it on. I would hear the familiar beep of the microwave around 4 o'clock, the exact time I usually heated up leftover dinner. Cabinet doors would open and close in the kitchen, following the pattern of my usual snack preparation. The most unnerving part was hearing my own routine being performed upstairs while I sat in the basement doing my job. It was like listening to a recording of my normal night. Except I was not the one making those sounds. Someone else was moving through my house, opening my cabinets, using my appliances, and following my schedule with disturbing precision. I began documenting everything, writing down the exact times I heard footsteps, appliance sounds, and cabinet doors. The pattern was incredibly consistent. Every sound happened at the precise time I would normally make that movement or use that appliance. Whoever was in my house had been watching me long enough to memorize my entire routine. The footsteps were always the same weight and pace as my own. The coffee maker ran for exactly the same duration I typically used. Even the microwave would beep for the same number of times I usually set it for. This level of detail suggested someone had been observing me for weeks or months, learning every aspect of my nightly habits. I installed a security camera in the kitchen, angled to capture the main walking area where I heard most of the sounds. The first night with the camera, I watched my monitors while simultaneously listening to the familiar footstep pattern above me. But when I checked the kitchen camera feed, the room was completely empty. No movement, no person, nothing to explain the sounds I was clearly hearing. This continued for several more nights, hearing detailed activity upstairs while seeing absolutely nothing on the camera. I started to question my sanity, wondering if the isolation and night shift work were causing some kind of auditory hallucinations. But the sounds were too specific, too consistent, and too closely matched to my routine to be imaginary. I decided to test the situation by changing my routine slightly. Instead of taking my break at 3 in the morning, I waited until 3:30. The footsteps upstairs adjusted to match my new timing. When I made coffee at 3:45 instead of 3:15, I heard the coffee maker turn on upstairs at exactly 3:45. Whoever was in my house was not following a memorized schedule. They were actively watching me and mimicking my movements in real time. This meant they had visual access to my basement office and could see when I stood up, when I walked toward the stairs, and when I performed specific actions. I spent an entire night searching for hidden cameras or other surveillance equipment in the basement, but found nothing. The house had been thoroughly renovated before we moved in, with new electrical work and updated systems, so it seemed unlikely that someone had installed monitoring devices during construction. The breakthrough came when I decided to remain completely still during my usual break time. I sat in my chair, did not make coffee, did not go upstairs, and did not follow any part of my normal routine. For the first time in weeks, the house remained silent. No footsteps, no appliances, no cabinet doors. Whoever was upstairs was clearly responding to my actions, not following a predetermined script. I realized that someone had been living in my house, hiding somewhere during the day when my grandmother and I were active, and emerging at night to shadow my movements. They had learned my routine so perfectly that they could anticipate my actions and move through the house while staying just out of sight. The next night, I pretended to start my normal routine but stopped halfway through. I walked toward the stairs as if going to the kitchen, then quietly returned to my monitors. Within seconds, I heard footsteps upstairs moving toward the kitchen. Someone was definitely following me, staying one room ahead to avoid detection. I called the police and explained the situation, though I knew it sounded bizarre. 2 officers came to investigate and conducted a thorough search of the house. They found evidence that someone had been living in the crawl space above the main floor ceiling, a small area accessible through the attic that provided a perfect hiding spot with visual access to most rooms through gaps in the old ceiling. The space contained blankets, food containers, and a small notebook filled with detailed observations about my grandmother's and my daily schedules. The notes included precise timing of when we slept, when we were out of the house, what we ate, and even personal conversations we had had in the kitchen. Someone had been watching and documenting our lives for months. They also found a small hole drilled in the basement ceiling that provided a clear view of my computer setup. This explained how the intruder could monitor my work routine and mimic my movements with such accuracy. They had been watching me work every night, learning my habits, and then performing a shadow version of my routine in the rooms above. The intruder was never caught, but evidence suggested they had been accessing the house through a loose attic vent that connected to the roof. They probably entered during the day when we were both occupied and hid in the crawl space until nighttime. The setup was sophisticated and suggested someone with construction knowledge who understood how to move through houses without detection. We installed proper security throughout the house, sealed all potential entry points, and added motion sensors in areas that had previously been unmonitored. My grandmother was shaken by the revelation that someone had been living above her bedroom for months, watching her sleep and documenting her routine. The most disturbing aspect was realizing that this person had no interest in stealing anything or causing immediate harm. They seemed content to observe, document, and mimic our lives while remaining hidden. The notebook contained months of detailed observations about our habits, preferences, and schedules, suggesting a level of obsession that went far beyond typical breaking and entering. I eventually had to change jobs because I could not focus on security monitoring while worrying about who might be watching me. Every sound in the house made me wonder if someone was hiding nearby, learning my new routine and preparing to begin their shadow performance again. The violation of having someone secretly live in your home, watching your most private moments, changes your relationship with safety and privacy permanently. Even now, in a different house with better security, I still listen carefully during my breaks, wondering if those familiar footsteps might return to echo my movements from somewhere just out of sight. My name is Sofia Martinez, and I am an art student from the University of New Mexico. Last September, I rented a small cabin in the mountains outside Albuquerque for a month-long independent study project. The isolation was exactly what I needed to focus on my painting, but it also made me the perfect target for someone with very disturbing intentions. The cabin was about 30 minutes from the nearest town, nestled in a grove of pine trees with large windows that provided beautiful natural light for my artwork. It was a single-story structure with a wraparound porch, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a spacious living area that I had converted into my studio space. The owner was an elderly woman who lived in Santa Fe and rented the property to artists and writers seeking creative solitude. I had been there for about a week when I first noticed that something felt wrong. It was subtle at first, just a feeling of being watched that I initially attributed to the isolation and unfamiliar surroundings. But as the days passed, the sensation grew stronger, especially when I was working near the large windows that faced the forest. The cabin had windows on all sides, and I loved the feeling of being surrounded by nature while I painted. During the day, I kept most of the curtains open to maximize the natural light. But at night, those same windows became sources of anxiety. The darkness outside seemed to press against the glass, and I found myself checking and rechecking the locks before going to bed. About 10 days into my stay, I discovered the first piece of evidence that my unease was justified. While walking around the cabin one morning to stretch my legs, I noticed footprints in the soft soil beneath the living room windows. They were clearly fresh, made sometime during the night when the ground was still damp from an evening rain shower. The prints were from men's boots, size 10 or 11, and they formed a pattern that suggested someone had been standing at the window for an extended period. There were deeper impressions where the person had shifted their weight, indicating they had remained in that spot for quite some time. The positioning of the prints showed that whoever made them had been looking directly into my improvised studio where I spent most of my time. I called the property owner, Mrs. Gutierrez, to report the footprints, but she seemed unconcerned. She suggested it might have been a maintenance worker checking on the property, or perhaps a hiker who had gotten lost and was looking for help. Her casual dismissal made me question whether I was overreacting, but the footprints were definitely deliberate and purposeful, not the random marks of someone passing by. That night, I made sure all curtains were tightly closed before settling into work. But around 11 o'clock, I heard a soft tapping sound coming from the direction of the kitchen window. It was rhythmic and gentle, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against the glass. When I crept toward the kitchen to investigate, the tapping stopped immediately. I stood in the darkened kitchen for several minutes, listening intently, but heard nothing more. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through a gap in the curtains, I saw nothing but darkness and the silhouettes of trees. But the timing was too perfect. The tapping had stopped the exact moment I approached the window, suggesting that whoever was outside could see my movements inside the cabin. The next day brought a discovery that made my blood run cold. While taking my morning walk around the property, I found a small digital camera partially hidden in the bushes near the bedroom window. It was camouflaged with green tape and positioned to capture a clear view of the room where I slept. The camera was still recording, its tiny red light blinking steadily. My hands shook as I examined the device. It was a trail camera, the type used by hunters to monitor wildlife, but it had been modified and carefully positioned to spy on the cabin. The angle and placement showed that whoever put it there had intimate knowledge of the cabin's layout and my daily routines. They knew which room I slept in and had positioned the camera for maximum surveillance. I immediately called the sheriff's department, and Deputy Rodriguez arrived within an hour. He took the camera as evidence and conducted a thorough search of the property. We found 2 more cameras, one near the living room window where I did my painting, and another positioned to monitor the front entrance and my car. The cameras had been recording for at least a week, capturing footage of me arriving, unpacking, setting up my studio, and going about my daily routine. Deputy Rodriguez explained that this level of surveillance suggested someone was not just randomly spying, but was specifically targeting me and studying my habits for some unknown purpose. The most disturbing discovery came when we examined the memory cards from the cameras. They contained hours of footage showing me working, sleeping, cooking, and moving through the cabin completely unaware that I was being watched. But there were also videos taken from inside the cabin showing that someone had been entering the property while I was away. The interior footage showed a man in his 40s wearing dark clothing and gloves moving through my living space with disturbing familiarity. He went through my belongings, examined my paintings, and spent considerable time looking through my personal items. In one video, he was sitting on my bed holding one of my sweaters and bringing it to his face. Deputy Rodriguez identified the man as someone with a history of stalking and breaking into properties rented by young women. His name was David Kellerman, and he had been arrested twice before for similar behavior in Colorado and Arizona. He specifically targeted isolated rental properties where single women stayed alone, using surveillance equipment to study their routines before escalating to break-ins. The investigation revealed that Kellerman had been watching the cabin for weeks before I arrived, waiting for the right tenant. He had somehow gained access to the rental listings and specifically chose properties rented by young women who would be staying alone for extended periods. My artist residency made me a perfect target because he knew I would be isolated and focused on my work. Police found his campsite about half a mile from the cabin, hidden in a dense area of forest. He had been living there for over a month, equipped with sophisticated surveillance equipment, camping gear, and detailed notes about my daily activities. His notebook contained my schedule, descriptions of my appearance, and disturbing personal observations about my habits and preferences. The campsite also contained photographs that he had taken of me through the cabin windows, printed on a portable printer. Some were taken during the day while I was painting, others at night when I was getting ready for bed. The photos were organized chronologically and included written comments about my appearance and activities that made it clear this was not random voyeurism, but an obsessive fixation. Kellerman was arrested 2 days later at a gas station in town where he was purchasing supplies. The police found additional surveillance equipment in his truck, along with cable ties, duct tape, and other items that suggested his intentions went far beyond simple observation. Deputy Rodriguez told me that based on the evidence, they believed he was planning to eventually approach or confront me directly. During questioning, Kellerman admitted to stalking multiple women in similar situations over the past 5 years. He would identify isolated rental properties, conduct surveillance for weeks, and then escalate to breaking in and spending time in their living spaces while they were away. In some cases, he had been living in or near rental properties simultaneously with his victims for weeks without their knowledge. The psychological evaluation revealed that Kellerman was obsessed with the idea of sharing living spaces with women without their consent. He derived satisfaction from being close to them, learning their habits, and infiltrating their private lives while remaining undetected. The cameras allowed him to feel connected to his victims even when he was not physically present. I had to cut my residency short and return to Albuquerque, but the experience left me with lasting trauma that affected my ability to work alone or stay in isolated locations. The knowledge that someone had been watching me sleep, documenting my movements, and entering my living space while I was gone created a violation of privacy that took months of therapy to address. The case went to trial 6 months later, and Kellerman was sentenced to 8 years in prison for stalking, breaking and entering, and violation of all privacy. But knowing he is locked up does not erase the memory of seeing those photographs of myself taken without my knowledge, or the realization that someone had been sharing my living space and studying my life with such obsessive detail. Mrs. Gutierrez installed comprehensive security systems at the cabin and now screens tenants more carefully. But she told me that the experience made her reconsider renting to single women staying alone. The isolation that makes these properties attractive to artists and writers also makes them ideal hunting grounds for predators who know how to exploit vulnerability and privacy. I still paint, but I no longer work near large windows or stay in isolated locations alone. The art that was supposed to come from solitude and natural beauty instead came from the terrifying knowledge that privacy is often just an illusion, and that the most dangerous watchers are the ones you never know are there. My name is Jackson Miller, and I am 17 years old from Burlington, Vermont. What happened to me last fall during my uncle's business trip still makes me question how well we really know the people we trust. I was house sitting for my Uncle David, who lives in a quiet residential neighborhood about 15 minutes from where my parents and I live. He had asked me to stay at his place for 2 weeks while he traveled to Europe for work, taking care of his elderly cat and making sure the house looked occupied. Uncle David lived alone in a modest 2-story colonial house on Maple Street, surrounded by families who had been neighbors for years. It was the kind of neighborhood where people knew each other's names, borrowed lawnmowers, and looked out for one another. Before leaving, my uncle introduced me to several neighbors and gave them my phone number in case any problems arose while he was away. The most helpful of these neighbors was Mr. Peterson, a man in his 50s who lived 3 houses down. He worked from home as some kind of consultant and seemed to know everyone in the neighborhood. Uncle David told me that Mr. Peterson was incredibly reliable and had helped with various house projects over the years. He had a key to the house for emergencies and had offered to check on me periodically while I was staying there alone. For the first few days, everything went smoothly. I attended school during the day and returned to Uncle David's house in the evening to do homework, feed the cat, and maintain my normal routine. Mr. Peterson stopped by twice during that first week, once to bring me some homemade cookies from his wife and another time to check that the heating system was working properly. I appreciated his attention and kindness, especially since I was still adjusting to sleeping in an unfamiliar house. Mr. Peterson seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being and made sure I had his phone number in case I needed anything. He mentioned several times that I should not hesitate to call him, even in the middle of the night, if anything seemed wrong or if I felt unsafe. By the end of the first week, Mr. Peterson's visits had become a daily occurrence. He would stop by every evening around 6 o'clock, always with some practical reason. Checking the mail, inspecting the exterior lights, or bringing me food that his wife had prepared. While I was grateful for the attention, I started to notice that his visits were lasting longer, and that he seemed particularly interested in my daily schedule. He would ask detailed questions about my school hours, what time I usually got home, whether I had plans for the weekend, and if any friends or family members were planning to visit. At first, I assumed he was just being thorough about neighborhood security, but gradually I realized that his questions were more specific than necessary for simple safety concerns. Mr. Peterson also began commenting on things that suggested he had been observing the house more closely than I had realized. He mentioned noticing that I kept late hours on weekends, that I had been watching television in the living room until nearly midnight, and that I had received several packages during the week. These observations required more surveillance than casual neighborly attention. The situation became genuinely unsettling when Mr. Peterson started letting himself into the house without knocking. He would use his emergency key and appear in the kitchen while I was doing homework or watching television, always with some excuse about checking on the furnace or investigating a strange noise he had heard. The first few times I accepted his explanations, but the frequency and timing of these unannounced visits made me increasingly uncomfortable. What disturbed me most was that Mr. Peterson always seemed to know exactly when I was home alone and when I would be arriving from school. He would appear within minutes of my return from school or emerge from somewhere in the house just as I was settling in for the evening. This level of timing suggested that he was monitoring my movements much more closely than appropriate. I started paying attention to Mr. Peterson's behavior and noticed details that should have alarmed me earlier. He knew which lights I typically turned on in the evenings, what I usually ate for dinner, what television programs I watched, and even what time I usually went to bed. This knowledge required observation that went far beyond casual neighborly interest. One evening, I decided to test my growing suspicion by varying my routine. Instead of coming straight home from school, I went to the library and stayed until nearly 8 o'clock. When I finally arrived at Uncle David's house, Mr. Peterson was waiting in his driveway and immediately approached me, asking why I was so late and whether everything was all right. His concern seemed excessive for someone who was simply watching out for me, and his knowledge of my usual schedule was too precise to be casual observation. I realized that Mr. Peterson had been tracking my daily movements with an attention to detail that crossed the line from helpful neighbor to something much more concerning. The breakthrough came when I found evidence that Mr. Peterson had been entering the house regularly when I was at school. I had started leaving small objects in specific positions before leaving in the morning. A book placed at a particular angle, a coffee cup positioned precisely on the counter, a magazine folded to a specific page. Each day, these items had been moved slightly, indicating that someone was spending time in the house while I was away. I also discovered that food was disappearing from the refrigerator in small amounts, and that the television was warm when I returned home, suggesting it had been used during the day. Someone was clearly making themselves comfortable in the house while I was at school, and Mr. Peterson was the only person with a key and detailed knowledge of my schedule. The most disturbing discovery came when I found a notebook hidden in the basement that contained detailed observations about my daily routine, personal habits, and even physical descriptions of my appearance and behavior. The handwriting was not Uncle David's, and the observations were far too detailed and personal to be innocent neighborhood watch activities. The notebook contained entries spanning several weeks, including dates before I had even arrived to house sit. This meant that whoever was writing these observations had been planning something involving me for quite some time. The entries included comments about my vulnerability, my isolation from family, and speculation about my personal relationships that made it clear this was not innocent surveillance. I called my parents immediately and explained the situation. They drove over that night and helped me search the house more thoroughly. We found additional evidence that someone had been using the house regularly, including personal items that did not belong to Uncle David and modifications to the basement that created a small living space behind the furnace. When we called the police, they took the situation very seriously. Detective Williams explained that using emergency access to enter someone's home for unauthorized surveillance was a serious crime, especially when it involved monitoring a minor. The notebook provided clear evidence of stalking behavior that had escalated to the point of illegal entry and invasion of privacy. The police arrested Mr. Peterson the next morning when they found him in Uncle David's house while I was at school. He had been using his emergency key to enter the property daily, sometimes spending several hours inside while I was away. He had created a comfortable setup in the basement where he could monitor my activities and document his observations about my routine and behavior. During questioning, Mr. Peterson admitted that he had been planning this surveillance for months, waiting for an opportunity when Uncle David would be away and I would be staying alone. He had volunteered to be the neighborhood contact specifically so he could gain access to the house and monitor me without suspicion. His helpful neighbor persona was entirely calculated to gain trust and access. The investigation revealed that Mr. Peterson had a history of similar behavior involving other young people in previous neighborhoods. He would identify vulnerable situations where teenagers were staying alone and position himself as a helpful adult figure while secretly conducting surveillance and documenting their personal lives. In 2 previous cases, his behavior had escalated to physical confrontation when his victims had become suspicious. Mr. Peterson was charged with stalking, breaking and entering, invasion of privacy, and endangering the welfare of a minor. The case went to trial 8 months later and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But the psychological impact of learning that someone I trusted had been secretly living in the house and monitoring my every move took much longer to process. Uncle David was devastated to learn that someone he had trusted with his home and my safety had been using that trust to prey on me. He installed a complete security system and changed all the locks, but he also struggled with the guilt of having unknowingly facilitated the surveillance by providing access and legitimacy to someone with dangerous intentions. The experience taught me that predators often use positions of trust and authority to gain access to their victims. Mr. Peterson's Helpful Neighbor Act was perfectly designed to deflect suspicion while providing unlimited access to monitor and document my personal life. The most dangerous people are often those who appear most trustworthy and helpful, because their position makes it difficult to question their motives until the behavior becomes undeniably inappropriate. Even now, I am suspicious of adults who seem overly interested in my schedule or who position themselves as helpful figures without clear reasons for their attention. That false sense of security and trust can be more dangerous than obvious threats because it prevents victims from recognizing danger until the situation has already escalated beyond appropriate boundaries. My name is Avery Thompson, and I work remotely from my apartment in Boise, Idaho as a graphic designer. The flexibility of working from home has always been one of my favorite aspects of my job. But what happened to me last month made me realize how that routine can make you vulnerable to people with dangerous intentions. I live alone in a ground-floor apartment in a quiet complex near the University District. The building has about 20 units and most residents are either graduate students or young professionals like myself. The complex has a secure entry system, but delivery drivers are typically buzzed in without much scrutiny, especially during the day when most people are expecting packages. My work involves frequent online orders, art supplies, computer equipment, and various materials for client projects. I probably receive packages 3 or 4 times a week, which has become such a normal part of my routine that I barely pay attention to delivery schedules anymore. Most drivers just leave packages outside my door with a quick knock or ring of the doorbell. 3 weeks ago, I noticed that my deliveries were becoming more frequent and coming at unusual times. I would find packages on my doorstep that I had not ordered, usually small items like office supplies or household goods. At first, I assumed there was some mix-up with addresses or that my upstairs neighbor was having items delivered to the wrong unit. The packages were always addressed to me, though, with my correct name and apartment number. When I checked my credit card statements and online accounts, I could not find any record of having ordered these items. I called a few of the shipping companies to report the error, but they insisted the items had been legitimately ordered from my address using valid payment information. After about a week of mysterious deliveries, I decided to stay home one day and watch for the delivery driver to see if I could figure out what was happening. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my doorbell rang and I immediately went to answer it. Standing outside was a man in a delivery uniform holding a small package. He was in his 30s, average height, with dark hair and an overly friendly demeanor that seemed forced. When I opened the door, he smiled broadly and said he had been making deliveries to my apartment for several weeks and wanted to make sure I was satisfied with the service. He asked detailed questions about my work schedule, whether I was usually home during the day, and if I lived alone. The questions felt intrusive, but I assumed he was just being thorough about delivery logistics. I mentioned that I worked from home most days and that packages could be left outside my door if I was not available to answer. He seemed pleased by this information and lingered outside my apartment for several more minutes, making small talk about the neighborhood and complimenting my apartment's location. After he left, I realized that legitimate delivery drivers rarely have extended conversations with recipients or ask personal questions about living situations. His interest in my schedule and living arrangements seemed excessive for someone just delivering packages. I also noticed that he had been looking past me into my apartment while we talked, scanning the interior as if assessing the layout. Over the next few days, the mysterious packages continued arriving. But now I paid closer attention to the delivery process. I noticed that the same driver was making all the deliveries, even though the packages came from different companies that should have been using different shipping services. This suggested that someone was specifically arranging for the same person to have repeated access to my building and apartment. I started keeping track of delivery times and noticed they were becoming more frequent and occurring at specific times when I had previously mentioned being home. If I had told him I usually took lunch breaks around noon, packages would arrive right around 12 o'clock. If I had mentioned working late on certain projects, deliveries would come in the evening hours. The breakthrough came when I decided to install a small security camera near my door to monitor delivery activity. The first day with the camera, I captured footage that made my blood run cold. The delivery driver was not just dropping off packages and leaving. He was using some kind of tool to manipulate my door lock and spending several minutes inside my apartment while I was out. The video showed him entering my apartment, walking through the rooms and examining my personal belongings with disturbing familiarity. He went through my desk drawers, looked at photographs, and spent considerable time in my bedroom, opening closets and examining clothing. He was clearly using the delivery visits as opportunities to case my apartment and learn about my personal life. I immediately called the police and showed them the security footage. Detective Morrison took the case very seriously and explained that using delivery services to gain access to homes was an increasingly common tactic used by burglars and stalkers. The fake packages provided legitimate cover for repeated visits and allowed the perpetrator to study potential victims and their routines. The investigation revealed that the man was not actually employed by any of the shipping companies whose uniforms he wore. His name was Robert Chen, and he had been purchasing delivery uniforms online and creating fake packages to gain access to apartment complexes throughout the city. He specifically targeted young women who lived alone and worked from home. Police found his apartment filled with stolen items from dozens of homes, photographs of women taken without their knowledge, and detailed notes about the daily routines of potential victims. He had been conducting this scheme for over a year, using fake deliveries to identify vulnerable targets, and then escalating to burglary or worse. Chen's notes about me were particularly disturbing. He had documented my work schedule, social activities, and even personal habits like what I typically wore around the apartment. He knew when I usually showered, when I ordered food, and when I was most likely to be distracted by work projects. He had been planning something much more serious than simple burglary. The investigation revealed that Chen had a history of sexual assault charges in another state and had been using the delivery scheme to identify and monitor potential victims. Several other women came forward after his arrest, reporting similar experiences with mysterious packages and overly friendly delivery drivers who asked too many personal questions. Chen had been using the fake deliveries to gradually desensitize victims to his presence and gather information about their vulnerabilities. The packages created a sense of routine and familiarity that made his frequent visits seem normal and legitimate. By the time victims became suspicious, he already had detailed knowledge of their homes and schedules. The most disturbing aspect was learning that Chen had been planning to escalate his behavior. Police found detailed plans for home invasions, including information about which victims would be easiest to overpower and which apartments provided the best opportunities for assault without detection. My security camera had likely prevented a much more serious crime. Chen was arrested and charged with burglary, stalking, identity theft, and possession of stolen property. During the investigation, police linked him to over 30 similar cases across 3 states. He had been using the fake delivery scheme to commit crimes for several years, always moving to new areas when local police began investigating suspicious delivery patterns. The case went to trial 6 months later, and Chen was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But the psychological impact of learning that someone had been systematically infiltrating my personal space and planning to assault me was devastating. I had to move to a different apartment and completely change my work routine and online ordering habits. I now verify all deliveries before accepting packages, require identification from all delivery personnel, and never provide personal information about my schedule or living situation to strangers. I also installed comprehensive security equipment and changed my delivery address to a secure pickup location rather than having items sent directly to my home. The experience taught me that predators are constantly evolving their tactics to exploit new vulnerabilities created by modern conveniences. The rise of online shopping and frequent deliveries has created opportunities for criminals to gain legitimate access to private spaces while appearing to provide normal services. What made Chen's scheme so effective was that delivery drivers are expected to be in residential areas, asking about schedules and having access to buildings and apartments. His fake packages provided perfect cover for surveillance and infiltration activities that would otherwise be obviously suspicious. Even now, I feel anxious whenever my doorbell rings unexpectedly or when delivery drivers ask questions beyond basic logistics. The violation of having someone systematically infiltrate my personal space while pretending to provide a service has permanently changed how I interact with strangers and how much personal information I share in casual conversations. The case highlighted how criminals are adapting to exploit the trust and convenience that modern life depends on, turning everyday interactions into opportunities for predatory behavior that can escalate to serious violence. My name is Dakota Kim, and I am a 20-year-old college student at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. What happened to me last spring during my recovery from ACL surgery still haunts me and has completely changed how I view healthcare workers and the trust we place in people who enter our homes during vulnerable times. I had torn my ACL playing intramural soccer in February, requiring reconstructive surgery that left me bedridden for several weeks with limited mobility. My parents lived in California, so they arranged for a home health aide through a reputable medical agency to help me with daily tasks while I recovered in my off-campus apartment near the university. The apartment was a small one-bedroom place that I normally shared with my roommate Jessica, but she had moved out temporarily to do an internship in Atlanta. This meant I would be alone with whatever healthcare worker the agency assigned to me, which made my parents nervous but seemed necessary given my limited mobility and the pain medication that left me drowsy and disoriented. The agency sent someone named Marcus Williams, a man in his early 30s who had excellent credentials and references from previous clients. He was professional during our initial meeting, explaining his experience with post-surgical care and outlining a schedule for helping me with meals, medication management, and physical therapy exercises. He seemed competent and caring, which put both my parents and me at ease. For the first week, Marcus followed his schedule perfectly. He would arrive at 8 in the morning, help me shower and get dressed, prepare meals, assist with my physical therapy routine, and handle household tasks that I could not manage on crutches. He was professional, respectful of my privacy, and genuinely seemed invested in helping me recover quickly. The arrangement was supposed to last for 3 weeks until I could manage independently, but by the second week, Marcus began suggesting changes to the schedule that made me uncomfortable. He proposed staying overnight so he could monitor my pain levels and help if I needed assistance during the night. When I declined, he insisted that his other clients always appreciated having 24-hour care. Marcus also began asking increasingly personal questions about my social life, relationships, and family finances. He wanted to know if I had a boyfriend who might visit, whether my parents planned to check on me, and how much money I had access to for medical expenses. These questions seemed excessive for someone providing basic healthcare assistance. By the third week, Marcus had established a pattern of arriving earlier than scheduled and staying later than necessary. He would let himself in using the key I had given him and often be in my apartment when I woke up, claiming he wanted to check on me during the night. When I expressed discomfort with this arrangement, he assured me it was standard procedure for patients on strong pain medication. The situation became genuinely alarming when I discovered that Marcus had been going through my personal belongings while I slept. I found my laptop moved to different locations, dresser drawers slightly open, and personal documents that had been disturbed. When I confronted him about this, he claimed he was looking for my medication schedule and insurance information to better coordinate my care. Marcus also began making comments about my appearance and recovery that crossed professional boundaries. He would compliment my body during physical therapy sessions, make suggestive remarks about helping me bathe, and ask detailed questions about my intimate relationships that had no relevance to my medical care. When I tried to redirect these conversations, he would claim he was just being friendly and trying to keep my spirits up. The breaking point came when I woke up one night to find Marcus sitting in my bedroom chair watching me sleep. He claimed he was checking on my breathing and pain levels, but when I asked him to leave, he became defensive and insisted that monitoring patients during sleep was part of his job responsibilities. His presence in my bedroom at 3 in the morning felt predatory and inappropriate. I called the home health agency the next morning to request a different aide, but Marcus intercepted the call, taking the phone from me and speaking to his supervisor privately. He told me afterward that the agency was satisfied with his care and that changing aides mid-treatment would disrupt my recovery progress. He also mentioned that filing complaints could affect my insurance coverage and delay my return to school. That afternoon, while Marcus was supposedly running errands, I called the agency directly from my cell phone. The supervisor I spoke with had no record of Marcus calling them and seemed surprised by my description of his behavior. When I detailed his overnight stays, personal questions, and invasive monitoring, she immediately expressed concern and said this was not standard protocol for their aides. The supervisor explained that Marcus was only authorized to provide daytime care and should never have been staying overnight or accessing my apartment outside of scheduled hours. She also confirmed that going through patients' personal belongings and making inappropriate comments were serious violations of their professional standards. She promised to investigate immediately and send a replacement aide within 24 hours. When Marcus returned that evening, I told him that the agency was sending someone else to complete my care. His reaction was immediate and frightening. He became angry, defensive, and insisted that I was overreacting to normal healthcare procedures. He claimed that all his previous clients had been grateful for his dedicated attention and that I was being ungrateful for the extra care he provided. Marcus refused to leave my apartment that night, claiming he needed to properly transition my care to the new aid and that abandoning a patient mid-treatment would be irresponsible. When I insisted he leave, he became increasingly agitated and began making veiled threats about my safety and recovery. He implied that without his protection, I was vulnerable to break-ins or accidents. I managed to call 911 while Marcus was in the bathroom, and 2 police officers arrived within 15 minutes. When they asked Marcus to explain his presence in my apartment after being dismissed, he claimed there had been a misunderstanding and that he was still officially assigned to my case. However, when the officers called the agency, they confirmed that Marcus had been immediately suspended pending investigation. The police escorted Marcus from my apartment, but he returned 2 hours later using the key I had forgotten to retrieve from him. I was awakened by sounds in the kitchen and found him preparing food, claiming he was concerned about my nutrition and wanted to make sure I ate properly. The officers had to return and arrest him for criminal trespass in violation of a no-contact order. The investigation revealed that Marcus had a history of inappropriate behavior with female clients that the agency had either overlooked or inadequately investigated. 3 previous clients had filed complaints about boundary violations, unauthorized overnight stays, and invasive questioning, but Marcus had managed to explain away each incident as misunderstandings or necessary medical care. More disturbing was the discovery that Marcus had been photographing me while I slept and documenting personal details about my living situation, finances, and social connections. Police found his phone contained dozens of photos taken in my apartment without my knowledge, along with detailed notes about my daily routine, medication schedule, and periods of vulnerability. Marcus was charged with stalking, criminal trespass, invasion of privacy, and violation of professional standards. The Home Health Agency faced additional scrutiny for inadequate background checks and failure to properly investigate previous complaints. During the legal proceedings, 2 other women came forward with similar experiences involving Marcus's inappropriate behavior during their recovery periods. The psychological impact of having someone exploit my medical vulnerability was devastating. I had trusted Marcus with access to my home, my physical care, and my personal safety during one of the most helpless periods of my life. Learning that he had been documenting my vulnerability and photographing me without consent felt like a profound violation of the most basic human dignities. The case highlighted how medical professionals can exploit the trust and dependency that comes with home health care services. Patients recovering from surgery or managing chronic conditions are often isolated, medicated, and physically vulnerable, making them ideal targets for predators who use legitimate medical access to commit crimes. I had to complete my recovery with a different aid and additional security measures, but the experience left me with lasting anxiety about medical care and trusting healthcare workers in private settings. The violation of having someone exploit my physical helplessness and medical needs for predatory purposes created trust issues that affected my relationships with all healthcare providers. Marcus was sentenced to 18 months in prison and banned from working in healthcare, but the agency's failure to properly screen and monitor their employees raised broader questions about patient safety in home care situations. The case became part of a larger investigation into inadequate oversight of home health care workers and the vulnerability of patients who require in-home medical assistance. Even now, 2 years later, I remain hypervigilant about healthcare workers and never allow anyone to provide medical care in my home without additional oversight. The experience taught me that medical credentials and professional references cannot guarantee that someone will not exploit the trust and vulnerability that comes with providing intimate healthcare services. The most disturbing aspect was realizing that my physical recovery had been secondary to Marcus's personal agenda. He had used my medical needs as cover for stalking, surveillance, and exploitation, turning what should have been a healing process into a prolonged period of victimization that extended my vulnerability far beyond my original injury. My name is River Bennett, and I live in Salem, Oregon, in a small house about 10 minutes from downtown. What happened to me during a winter storm last January taught me that natural disasters create opportunities for predators who know how to exploit chaos and confusion to target vulnerable people. I am 23 years old and work as a freelance web developer, which means I spend most of my time at home working on my computer. I live alone in a modest single-story house in a quiet residential neighborhood where most of my neighbors are elderly or families with young children. It is the kind of place where people know each other by name and look out for one another, especially during emergencies. On January 15th, a massive ice storm hit the Pacific Northwest, bringing with it winds that knocked down power lines and tree branches throughout the region. By 8 o'clock that evening, my entire neighborhood had lost electricity, and the temperature inside my house was dropping rapidly as the heating system shut down. I had prepared for the storm by stocking up on flashlights, batteries, candles, and non-perishable food, but I had not anticipated how isolating and vulnerable the complete loss of power would make me feel. My cell phone had limited battery life, and with no internet or landline service, I was effectively cut off from the outside world. Around 10 o'clock, I heard someone knocking on my front door. When I looked through the peephole with my flashlight, I saw a man in what appeared to be an official utility company uniform, holding a clipboard and wearing a hard hat. He identified himself as a power company technician conducting door-to-door checks to assess damage and estimate repair times. The man seemed legitimate. He knew specific details about the storm, mentioned that several transformers in the area had been damaged, and explained that crews were working around the clock to restore power. He asked if I was experiencing any electrical hazards like downed lines near my house or unusual smells that might indicate gas leaks. His questions seemed reasonable, and I was grateful that the utility company was being so thorough about checking on residents during the emergency. When he asked if I lived alone and whether I had adequate heating sources to get through the night, I told him I was managing well with blankets and a small camping stove for heating food. The technician, who said his name was Frank, explained that the power outage was expected to last at least 2 more days due to the extent of the damage. He offered to check my electrical panel to make sure there were no safety issues that could cause problems when power was restored, and suggested I might want to stay with family or friends if I did not have adequate heating. I appreciated his concern and allowed him to examine the electrical panel in my basement. He spent about 10 minutes looking at the breaker box with his flashlight, making notes on his clipboard and explaining that everything looked safe. Before leaving, he gave me his business card and said crews would return the next day to continue assessments. After Frank left, I felt reassured that professionals were handling the emergency situation. But about an hour later, I heard someone trying to open my back door. When I investigated with my flashlight, I could see the door handle being turned from the outside, and someone was definitely attempting to enter my house. I grabbed a kitchen knife and called out that I was armed and had already called the police. The attempted entry stopped immediately, but I could hear footsteps moving around the outside of my house. Someone was circling the property, testing windows and trying other potential entry points. My cell phone had very little battery remaining, but I managed to call 911 and report the attempted break-in. The dispatcher said multiple officers were responding to emergency calls throughout the city due to the storm, but someone would be sent to check on me as soon as possible. She advised me to remain inside and avoid confronting the intruder directly. While waiting for police, I heard the person continue to move around my house, testing windows and doors systematically. It became clear that whoever was outside was not randomly trying to break in, but was methodically checking every possible entry point as if they were familiar with standard residential security vulnerabilities. About 30 minutes later, I heard someone at my front door again, claiming to be Frank returning to check on additional safety concerns. But this time his voice sounded different, and when I looked through the peephole, I could not see anyone in the darkness. The person was standing outside the range of my flashlight, which suggested they were deliberately trying to avoid being identified. I refused to open the door and told the person that police were on their way. Immediately, I heard rapid footsteps running away from the house, confirming that this was not a legitimate utility worker, but someone who was using the storm as cover for criminal activity. The police arrived about an hour later and conducted a thorough search of my property. They found evidence that someone had been attempting to pry open windows and had damaged the lock on my back door. Officer Martinez explained that power outages create ideal conditions for burglars who know that security systems are disabled and that residents are isolated and vulnerable. The business card that Frank had given me was fake. The utility company confirmed they were not conducting door-to-door checks and that all their crews were focused on repairing infrastructure, not individual assessments. The uniform and equipment he carried were easily purchased online and provided perfect cover for gaining access to homes during the emergency. Officer Martinez explained that criminals often monitor emergency services during natural disasters, listening to police scanners to identify areas where response times are delayed. They use official-looking uniforms and equipment to gain trust and access, then return later when they know residents are isolated and unable to call for help quickly. The investigation revealed that several homes in the area had been targeted during the storm using similar tactics. The perpetrator would pose as an emergency worker, utility technician, or relief volunteer to gain entry and assess homes for valuables and security weaknesses. He would then return later to commit burglaries when he knew residents were alone and cut off from communication. Police found the man 2 days later when power was restored and security cameras came back online. His name was Michael Torres, and he had an extensive criminal history of using natural disasters and emergencies to commit burglaries and home invasions. He specifically targeted areas where power outages disabled security systems and isolated residents from help. Torres had been monitoring emergency broadcasts and police communications to identify neighborhoods where power outages were expected to last multiple days. He would then pose as various types of emergency personnel to gain access to homes and gather information about residents, security systems, and valuable items that could be stolen later. The fake uniforms and equipment found in his possession were sophisticated and would have fooled most people during an emergency situation. He had uniforms for utility workers, emergency management personnel, and relief volunteers, along with clipboards, identification badges, and other props that made his impersonation convincing. During questioning, Torres admitted to targeting my house specifically because I had told him I lived alone and had valuable electronics for my work. He had planned to return after midnight when he knew I would be isolated and unable to call for help quickly due to limited cell phone battery and poor emergency response times during the storm. Torres was charged with attempted burglary, impersonating a public official, and criminal trespass. The investigation linked him to over 20 similar incidents across 3 states during various natural disasters over the past 2 years. He specifically targeted rural and suburban areas where residents were likely to trust official-looking personnel and where emergency response was delayed. The case highlighted how natural disasters create unique vulnerabilities that criminals actively exploit. The combination of disabled security systems, limited communication, delayed emergency response, and residents' increased willingness to trust people claiming to provide help creates ideal conditions for predatory behavior. I had to install battery backup systems for my security equipment and develop protocols for verifying the identity of anyone claiming to be emergency personnel. The experience taught me that criminals are often more organized and prepared for disasters than residents are, and they specifically plan to exploit the chaos and vulnerability that emergencies create. The psychological impact of having someone exploit my trust during a genuine emergency situation was particularly disturbing. Torres had used my natural desire to cooperate with authorities and accept help during a crisis to gather information that would have made me a victim of serious crimes later that night. Even now, I am suspicious of anyone who claims to be providing emergency services during disasters, and I always verify credentials through official channels before allowing anyone access to my home. The experience taught me that predators are often the best prepared people during emergencies because they have specifically planned to exploit the vulnerabilities that disasters create in normal security and communication systems. The storm that was supposed to bring my community together instead revealed how isolated and vulnerable we become when our normal safety networks fail, and how quickly criminals can exploit that vulnerability to target people who are just trying to survive difficult circumstances.